main reason to be here today. Mr. John Law, who's I'm going to be talking to, had some incredible adventures, has some interesting things to tell us about us, interesting and keep things new to the world from his long and varied career. And the one thing that John and I figured out as we've been planning for this talk is there's just not enough time. There's so many incredible things to talk about from Burning Man, Cacophony Society, Suicide Club, and tons of things in between. So with the theory that pictures are worth 1,000 words, hopefully we can start off here with about 30,000 words to get us started. The Many Faces of John Law. With all this stuff, and I know, John, it's never one person through all this stuff, and I think that's something we really want to. But when someone's facial hair is just so varied and impressive, I mean, I think you should be. There's a band playing here, the Conspiracy of Beards, later today, and I don't know. You should be teaching next year making beards.
Well, Stephen Rasmus got me on that.
That's true.
Growing a beard for 20 years.
So let's jump straight into things. I want to. You came to San Francisco in 1976.
Right. Yeah, I showed up here in 1976.
What was your? Tell us a little bit about how you got here, how old you were.
Well, I was 17. Ran away from home and skipped juvenile probation. Wanted to come to San Francisco because I thought there were a bunch of people, doing stuff here. I thought there was a hippie scene going on. I got here. I went to Haight Street. It was 1976. Haight Street was filled with junkies and knife fights. It was a very dangerous place at that time. And everybody told me, kid, you missed it. The party was here 8 years ago. And I refused to believe that. I just kept going on. And within a year, I ran into a group. Very fortunately, ran into a group called the Suicide Club, which sounds really ominous and spooky, but it was really was really a group of people that basically agreed to get their worldly affairs in order and live each day as over their last. That's what our moniker was or whatever. But it was a group that grew out of something that came from the 60s, which is the free school movement. And it's something that people don't really know that much about now, but in the late 60s, on college campuses all across the country, people started what they called free schools, and a lot of them were adjuncts of the actual university. There was one at San Francisco State, and it was called Communiversity. And it was a free school. Anybody, any student, or actually anybody who wasn't a student could teach a class, and the classes ranged from everything from practical classes like conversational French, how to fix your Volkswagen Bug. Everybody had a Volkswagen Bug back in the 60s. And stuff like that, to really kind of more outre stuff and more bizarre stuff like clown makeup. They had mime classes, you can't hate them for that. But,
and New College in the mission was kind of the last surviving.
Was the last man standing. Yeah. New College was the last man standing out of the free school movement in San Francisco. So this was, I didn't know any of this at the time. I was a 17-year-old juvenile delinquent. But
and say this is 76, and a lot of these things. So many of them had started in the 60s and had been surviving for a little bit already. But you've also got things like the communal the food co-op things going on.
Food co-ops were really big at that time. But Communiversity was an interesting thing because there was a fellow named Gary Warren who became the student administrator for it. He was a real strange and odd person. He's the most visionary human being I've ever worked with in my life. And he's not known now. He died tragically very young, but he decided they got in a little tiff with SF State, and so they took this free school, made it into a non-profit because then they could do pretty much whatever they wanted to. SF State was becoming a little uneasy with them doing more and more bizarre and kind of underground type events, and so they took it out, made a non-profit out of it. And his big interest was exploring the city and exploring personal fears. And that's what he was all about. And even Communiversity as a free school, which 100 people were involved in it, did classes, 100 people came and took the classes. And the way it was supported was by an annual garage, or triannual garage sale. It was all funded by people like donating their stuff. We do a garage sale and raise enough money to put out our calendar of classes. And then Gary kept getting more and more interested in the more arcane and bizarre and more underground, and like pranking, street pranks, street theater, stuff like that. And so he's got this idea for a group called the Suicide Club based on a story by Robert Louis Stevenson.
And the Robert Louis Stevenson story, by the way, Project Gutenberg is your friend. You can download that while we're talking.
Right, called the Suicide Club. It's a wonderful story about a group of people who put their worldly affairs in order and live each day as though it were their last. And that was his I don't know if it's a conceit, but it was definitely his philosophy. And so the Suicide Club was formed. He had 3 other people formed it with him: David Warren, Adrian Burke, who's an academic in Canada now and a writer, and Nancy Prussia. And the first event that they did, because Gary used to do storm watches, he was very interested in the physical environment and in testing their fears, and they would go down to the ocean beach whenever there was a giant storm. They went down the Golden Gate Bridge and used to be able to walk right out behind Fort Point, and there's a giant sea chain there. And the waves are coming in, crashing on the seawall, and going up 30 feet in the air, and then crashing down on top of it. And they kind of snuck out, clinging to this giant, cable or a chain rather, as the waves crashed down on them. Had they let go, they would have been swept out to sea and died. And then at the end of that, they were so invigorated, and their mind was pretty much expanded by doing this silly, crazy, but exciting life-risking thing. And they formed the Suicide Club based on that event. They wanted to do a group where people could come with a like mind and challenge their fears in whatever way that meant. It could mean anything. And so the type of events and the types of events that the group became known for were infiltrations of weird groups and cults was one of the ones that people knew about. Climbing and exploring the urban environment, which at that time San Francisco was largely an abandoned city in the commercial district, and some of the commercial and industrial districts. It's hard to believe now, but industry was fleeing the city, and there were a lot of abandoned buildings everywhere. So we did a lot of events in abandoned buildings, and none of this was theater per se. It was all for the people that were in the group.
Well, so it's interesting because there are a number of other. San Francisco had interesting people and a proliferation of scenes, as there always tended to be, right? Mm-hmm. So you in addition to the hippies, there were the diggers, who I know there was certainly awareness of, right, and a couple of connections, and they came more from a proper theater kind of concept.
Correct. The diggers, which were a 60s group that had some small influence on the stuff that we were doing. were a group that was known for, they wanted to live their lives as living theater, as though their life was a theater piece. And, Emmett Grogan, Peter Coyote, who's a pretty well-known actor now, is one of the main people in that group. And Emmett Grogan, who died, was kind of the main character. They had an influence on what we were doing.
And then
Surrealists had a big influence.
Right. As far as contemporaries, there's also like the Ant Farm going on, but again, that's more in an architecture context. I think what's interesting is that what you guys were doing, or what many things, is that you weren't sort of seeking publicity. And one of the big things that the Ant Farm was playing with PR and that kind of thing.
Right. They were an art group. They were an art group, and the interesting thing about the groups I've been involved in, many of them, is they weren't specifically designed as art groups. They didn't have an art agenda. They didn't have we weren't recording things for posterity. There's some photos and some video, but the Suicide Club had a kind of an unwritten rule about recording events. There was some recording, some photos, a little bit of film, but most of the events we did, if you were recording or filming an event, you couldn't be part of it. And so it was frowned on, unless with the exception of a couple types of events, which were actually media pranks. We did some media pranks. There was a group that started in the Suicide Club, which is still going now, and the people, I know the people in it, they're not in jail. It's called the Billboard Liberation Front, and that started in the Suicide Club event. They alter giant outdoor billboards, and they get the press for doing that. But they started the Suicide Club event. The Chinese New Year's Treasure Hunt in San Francisco, which is now a gigantic charity event with thousands of people involved, started as a Suicide Club event. There were some other people that came out of that group that were just doing interesting things. There was a group that encouraged people to challenge their fears and do things that they normally wouldn't do. I mean, we were also known for climbing buildings and bridges. That was probably the best known thing that we did.
And that's something you personally have been doing that since you were.
Well, I climbed and photographed bridges. Yeah.
It seems like. There's a real diversity of people and backgrounds. So it seems like, actually, we'll talk in a second about one of the events that really scared you. But the bridge stuff wasn't scary for you. So you can kind of bring that leadership around that to other people again.
And the idea was that anybody could do this stuff. It wasn't, the group wasn't, we weren't professional actors. We weren't climbers. Some of us became climbers. There were people who went on to become actors. There were people who went on to become noted artists. But that wasn't the point at the time. The point wasn't to record it. The point was to live in it. Mm-hmm. And that's what was so brilliant about it. There are groups now that I like and know about and affiliate with that are kind of involved in that sort of thing, particularly a New York group called Dark Passage that does events that are similar and in many ways better than what we did in the Suicide Club. They're not about recording the event. They're not about making a document for posterity, although some stuff is documented a little bit. They're about people getting together and doing really incredibly unusual things as though they were a normal process.
And Dark Passage is primarily urban exploration.
Urban exploration and using urban environments for games and costume events that are participatory, they're not theater, they're not done for an audience. Everybody that's involved is the audience, which is the one thing that how we related to a group like the Diggers, because they were one of the hippie groups that wasn't full of baloney as far as I was concerned, because they really believed in what they were doing, and they weren't trying to save the world. They were trying to save the people. They were trying to work with the people right around them. Right. There was very little BS in that group, from what I can tell. I mean, they started free food drives in the '60s that had been carried on by Food Not Bombs and groups like that.
And they did the free store.
Free store. They believed in free. I mean,
and
free is a great concept.
Let's connect that to the garage sale and the way you guys did the garage sale fundraiser. Yeah, which
we didn't have any money, and in order to put out the catalog for the university calendar, which was the free school we were talking about earlier, we did a garage sale. People donated junk stuff, cleaned out their closets or donated it to us. They were part of the group too, and we'd have these giant garage sales and sell stuff, but there was no price for anything. You could pay anything you wanted for whatever the item was. And what would happen, this is an interesting psychology, and as H.L. Mencken once said, guilt is a terrible thing. But people would come in, and one person would always come in and find a stereo that was worth $20, which would be like $100 now, and he'd give you a quarter for it. For everybody that did that, 100 people would give you $2 for a thing that was not worth anything. It was basically, or $4 for something that wasn't worth anything. So it balanced out, and on the balance, we make enough money to put out our calendar of events every year. And it was a completely community-based thing. It's a community is a word that's overworked. But it's a really important thing. It's one of the reasons why I like and support the Maker Faire. Despite the fact that they're underwritten by a corporation, the ideas and the principles that they're promoting are really important right now, I think. So a little pimping for the makers
Yeah,
there,
well,
but,
and on that note, because making culture and making our cultural revolution is the title of this talk, but if we're going to pull out a couple lessons, the first one is don't believe them when they tell you it just ended. There's nothing more to do.
yeah, sure. In San Francisco, everybody, kids, you go home, it was over, it's all done, 8th Street's over, it's finished, like, get out of here. And they were so full of crap. I mean, within a year, the punk scene started, which, was better than the hippie scene as far as I'm concerned, because we remember everything. But, I mean, and then the Suicide Club, which is underground group, there's shit happening right now. I mean, us old guys talking about stuff, this is great. If you hear some stories that you can use, excellent.
Yeah.
But, there's stuff happening right now that I don't know about, they won't tell me about because I'm too old. But it's going on right now, and there's people here doing it, and that's really awesome. And I feel blessed to have been a part of this, whatever the hell it is, for so long.
So let's jump back to community university for just a second, and because this is a through line that we'll see as we talk about Suicide Club and Cacophony. Is this the foundation for the newsletter kind of thing, this catalog sort of thing? Because that's one common thread through. So the nature of some of these groups is definitely Cacophony Society is they're loosely organized. There aren't strict meetings where the same people show up every time. You kind of tune into the stuff you want. You vote with your feet, as you said, and a bunch of events will get listed. And people, some of them will have tons of people at them from the group. Others will have very small attendance or no attendance. So do you think that traces all of that? Is this the first of this?
Well, yeah, we used to do, there was no internet. There was no way to contact people. If you had some interest in some arcane or like little known area of knowledge, you could, finding someone else who had that same interest was like a miracle. It's like you found your long lost brother.
Yeah.
Okay, you couldn't go online and punch a button and immediately know 1,000 people across the country who are interested in transmicalian swallows and how fast they can fly or whatever arcane thing it might be. But that's a good thing. I'm not against that. I think the internet's awesome. But at that time, you really had to work to find other people. There's a group called the Church of the Subgenius, which is still extant to some degree. One of the main instigators sitting in the back row in the glass was very than I had. But this is a group that came out of the mail art scene to some degree, and they would mail these crazy religious tracts around the country, and people would see them.
And when we say religious tracts, they were positioned as religious tracts or stated as religious tracts.
You mean it's not a real religion?
I'll explain to you later.
But you put this stuff in coffee shops and hope that some weirdo would see it and give you a call. And so the Church of the Subgenius did this. They were a great example of that, and built up a constituency all around the country of crazy kids locked in a room, like trying to find somebody who had an interest in the same arcane literary thing that they were interested in or whatever. And there were little groups like that popping up. This stuff morphed into the internet eventually. It turned, as the computer world started rising up, all the stuff that we were doing. Community University calendar, we had a Gestetner printer. Okay, a Gestetner printer is a big metal thing like this. You pour a bunch of ink in it, and you put paper in it, and we had one that had been handed down, so we didn't have any money. So this had been, we got it from a nonprofit because, it was broke, and then we figured out how to fix it, but it had been some company that owned it before, and then, and then it was this thing that was like 20 years old, and you try to print out your newsletters, and it invariably end up chewing all the paper up and spitting ink all over everything. And we'd do this, we'd have like mailing parties, and then we'd mail these out, and we'd put them in coffee shops, and that's how people got to know about the stuff that we were doing, and then they would become involved, and they would have some obsession or some interest, and they would do it as a class. Later in the Suicide Club, which was more underground and more subversive, I guess you'd call it, people would create events. I mean, anyone could create an event that wanted to. That was the miracle of these groups, and the miracle of groups now that are around, where people can get involved. I mean, the thing about getting involved in something, you can get involved in something. If you like something somebody's doing, just go there and be a test and don't leave. Great example is SRL, Survival Research Labs, which is a machine art group that's been going for many, many years in San Francisco. Pretty well-known art, they're an actual art group. And if you want to get involved in a group like that, just go down there and volunteer, work for free, clean the floor, bring coffee, and then start talking to people, get to know people, and find out how to become involved and build things. I mean, the whole steampunk scene, I think, started that way. People just wanting to build stuff.
Yeah.
And it's not that hard.
And whether it's the printing press or Twitter or Tumblr or just a web page or whatever, these days it's like accessible technology
much easier to find
that's
out
cheap
about.
or free,
Yes.
that you can proliferate and communicate and find the people that are either inclined to the stuff you do or the stuff that or already doing the stuff that you do. You know, it's yeah. The Diggers had one of the little digger anecdotes I really like is they had a big party and they actually had a printing press at the party or mimeograph or something. And they would be running off newspapers during the party. It's like, hey, this guy just kissed this girl. And
right.
There's new punch that's there's this man who got the punch.
That was their version of Twitter.
Around in real time. Yeah.
That was their version of Twitter.
So let's jump into Suicide Club a bit. And one thing that's interesting is we'll talk about some of the profound events, but then there are also events that were much less. I mean, this is something that was a pretty small sort of.
Somebody had seen a movie or several movies showing people at a Bon Voyage party for a giant ocean liner. It looked like a lot of fun. So we went and crashed a Bon Voyage party for an ocean liner. And like I said, there weren't a lot of photos taken at the time. But this is us after we got kicked out in front of on the pier. And it seemed like a funny idea for an event. And somebody came up with it, hey, this would be a fun idea for an event. People came and we went on the boat. We're on it for about 15, 20 minutes before they kicked us off. And then just kept on. But people could do any kind of event they wanted to. They ranged from the simplest thing like going to see a movie that you liked and talking about it afterwards to doing an elaborate event in an abandoned brewery with 30 people dressed up in costumes chasing people around. And
so there's like 12 to 15 folks in this photograph. This is fairly early on in the
Yeah, that was 1977. I had just joined. The group had just started about 4 months before this.
And how many people were there in total, would you say?
The Suicide Club at its height on our mailing list had 100 people. Anybody could, we had a newsletter, which came out every month. And anyone could edit it, and the editorship rotated. So sometimes you'd have these beautiful newsletters with little graphics, like Don Herron did this. Don Herron, who does the Dashiell Hammett Walking Tour in San Francisco, which is the longest standing literary walking tour in the country, which started as a Suicide Club event. He was a historian. He got interested in pulp fiction when he was a kid. He came out here, he joined the Suicide Club, and he wanted to do some kind of event, but he wasn't that interested in climbing in buildings or, doing stupid street theater. He liked detective fiction, so he thought, well, I know a little bit about Dashiell Hammett, so why don't I do a walking tour, because I know the places where Hammett lived, I know the places where the stories were set. He started this walking tour in the Suicide Club, and it's now a 34-year-long literary institution. He's in the New York Times, the London Times, he's been on television a million times. And he just got interested in it through realizing that he could just do it, and he could just go out and do it. I know this little bit of information about this arcane subject, or not even that arcane, and he just went and did it. There's another fellow whose name I can't mention, who's a local politician, who got involved in his career through doing stuff in the Suicide Club. Another fellow, actually two now, one who's an architectural historian, who used to sneak into abandoned buildings and do events in the buildings. And our philosophy about any environment we went into was that it wasn't our environment, we were borrowing it, we were there, we treated it respectfully, we never took anything, never broke anything, never tagged anything. That wasn't what it was about. And so this fellow, Bill Pistura, got interested in old buildings that we were going into, climbing up on the roof and photographing it. He became an architectural historian and wrote books on the architecture of Russian Hill. Peter Field does a walking tour of the Tenderloin now, working on a book of the history of the Tenderloin. And these people got their initial, partially some of their initial influence or inspiration to do this stuff through being in a group of people who had just chosen to take on and do stuff that they maybe never do by themselves.
And some of the stuff was stuff that literally was scary and in some ways dangerous.
Well, some of it was very scary.
Let's talk about the Mooney event real quick, because that's one of the most notorious and one of the most. I mean, the commitment to doing an event is more than showing up for an afternoon here.
For those of you who don't know who knows who the Moonies were or are? Okay. The Moonies were a religious group, and they're still around, pretty hardcore. Some people consider them a cult. In the 70s and 80s, there was a big controversy going about these types of groups that would get young people involved. The young people would then, within a year or so, give them all their money and never speak to their family again. And this is a fairly common thing, and they became a very, very well-known and powerful political group. But anyway, they're kind of scary. There were rumors about people going there and not being able to leave. We didn't know if anything was true or not. But they used to recruit people on the streets in San Francisco and Berkeley and other cities all around the country And they had like young people, nicely dressed with clipboards, and they looked for kids who were traveling, like a lot of hitchhikers. At that time, there were a lot of kids still showing up in San Francisco looking for the party, looking at the party. And the Moonies would kind of grab them, and they would invite them to come to their commune, which are all the young kids hitchhiking around were looking for a commune.
So you guys had basically two kind of levels to this event. There was sort of a larger thing where people, it was like
30 of us.
It's like go to dinner with a Moonie
Right.
or something.
30 of us went down to Union Square, got invited to one of their dinners, went to their dinner, and then pretended that we were interested and wanted to join. And then we did that for about a month. A bunch of different people went at different times. And then 5 of us ended up, we were invited, everybody was invited to go, but 5 of us actually could go. And we went to their retreat, one of their 2 rural retreats up in Calistoga, a place called Camp Cape. They had one in Boonville and they had one in Calistoga. And we went there for 2.5 days and hung out with them and tried to figure out what they were about. There were 5 of us who were pretending that we didn't know one another, which was really interesting. And worked pretty well, I think, for most of the time that we were there. But they were pretty paranoid, and they were very. It's such a long story. We went through it before. Right. In order to set the mood for how that group inculcated people into their scene, first off, you were never, throughout the entire day, you were never without sensory input. You were always talking to somebody, listening to a lecture, being in a group, prayer group, moving around, doing calisthenics. They do a calisthenic thing. I love this in the morning. You're in your little prayer group of 50 people. You all stand together. And your group leader, some of whom are pretty funny, would have you like brush the negativity off your body, and then do jumping jacks and all this stuff. It was pretty silly, but you're in this group that's completely self-contained. There's no outside input. There's no newspapers, no television, no radio, no outside input whatsoever. And after a little while, you start. People who are interested in looking for a real community of people doing something, on the surface they look pretty good. They were doing food drives and donating their services to different charitable things, all of which. And you find out later were owned by the Unification Church, and usually had some ulterior motive or some design involved. But people would disappear into this group, and so we weren't sure what to expect. And we wrote our wills before we went. We actually wrote out our wills.
Wow. And that was part of for the more intense events.
That was an intense suicide movie. That's one of the most intense things I ever did.
And it was
scary.
It was where this sort of one of the sort of mottos of scaring yourselves.
Though you did, though you're last.
Is where it connected it.
Yeah, and so the range of events went from doing, like I say, like street theater. And the street theater we did wasn't so much for people, audiences on the street. It just because it scared us because we weren't really actors, we weren't really performers. Although some people did become performers.
Well, you have to when you're trying to pretend you're in a cult.
Yes. Yeah, but the street theater stuff that we were doing, off from the movie thing, is a different thing entirely. But it was a challenging thing for certain people. Some people it didn't bother them at all, but just acting silly in public was a challenge to some people. The scariest thing.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and earn our NC-17 rating now.
Right.
There we go. That's it.
But this is the scariest thing I ever did. And I climbed things. I was a climber. I climbed, but it didn't scare me. I was not afraid of heights, and it would take people who had never been climbing into places and they really loved that and were challenged by that. I was not challenged by climbing. I was challenged by being embarrassed. So I was raised middle class, and there's certain things that you didn't do, like you did not get naked with a bunch of other people on the cable car. And it scared the hell out of me. I had a stomach, and I keep going. So
well, and this is one of these photos that it's iconic for me because there are events, and I've been happy enough to be in a few of them too, where you feel like you own the city. When you talk about making culture and the maker piece of this is like that photo of we're going to stand in the middle of the street and take our damn
my
picture
town.
now.
My town.
And you get to do that. The society is not set up to enable everyone to do that all the time. Yeah. But it's important, I think, to grab that.
Pretty polite about it. We weren't. We were not.
Well, let's talk about the rule of twos real quick.
Yeah.
Because that's an incredibly important. There's a reggae artist who's got a great line that says, "If you can't be good, you've got to be very careful." And that's what I think the rule of twos is all about. You got to be smart. If you're going to do responsible
don't do two things you're not supposed to do at the same time. Okay? Very simple rule. If you're doing one thing you're not supposed to do, concentrate on that. Don't do anything else that you're not supposed to do.
And talk about that as the owner and organizer of an event, whether it's Cacophony Society, we'll talk about Cacophony Society in a second. This is one of the early newsletters for that. Or Suicide Club. Mm-hmm. I mean, you would kind of, or Gary would stand up and give your...
Yeah, and Gary Warner was he was the avatar for the Suicide Club, and to date by far the single most amazing visionary I've ever worked with. Probably the only real comprehensive visionary. And he died really young, which is why you don't know who he was. But he had a whole routine for inculcating people, or not inculcating, but bringing people into the idea that they could create their own event, that they could make their own event. He was really interested, and Peter Field, who's still alive and doing events, he's a historian, and the Tenderloin is also very good about that, about getting people who are maybe shy or not, didn't feel like they were creators or makers, we'll use the current phrase for this sort of thing, and to encourage them to actually do an event, to build something based on some interest of theirs. Take your interest and make an event out of it that other people might want to, might be interested in, might want to actually help you do. And I found that the thing that's so amazing about San Francisco and the Bay Area, and the thing that puts it on the map, because frankly, in a lot of ways, San Francisco and the Bay Area is a provincial backwater compared to New York or LA or London. But the thing that puts us on the map here, and has always put us on the map here, is the fact that it's been an easy place for people to do collaborative work. It's not as career-driven. It's not as ego-driven, although there's plenty of big stupid egos here. It's not. I mean, it's a lot easier for you to have some goofy idea, but hey, let's do this, and like people will come and do it. You know, in New York, you know, if you're a professional artist or whatever, you've got to. People protect their ideas. They're, at least they have.
Or the and I've seen this happen. The conversation is, what do I get out of it? Here, it's very much like you've got a good idea. People are like, wow, that's an awesome idea. How can we do that? How can I help and make that happen? I mean, it sounds kind of goofy, but it is like the old Mickey Rooney movies of like, let's put on a show. It's like, let's put on a sewer walking tour.
Right.
Let's climb a building.
Or the ultimate example of that was in Tom Sawyer, from Tom Sawyer painting the white picket fence, where Tom Sawyer is painting a white picket fence and it's a lot of work and he doesn't want to do it, and he starts having really fun doing it. He's like really getting into it, painting the fence, and then a little while his friends come around and they watch him having so much fun, they start painting the fence, and then they're really painting the fence, and they're all really into painting the fence, and then he's having some lemonade under a parasol back there as his friends paint the fence. Well, that's kind of, in a way, how it works here. But, and that's certainly, I worked on one giant event that ended up being that to some degree. But, we'll talk about that later.
So let's talk about the birth of the Suicide Club real quick. Because you weren't actually, and this is something, bios have to get rewritten all the time, just to clarify that you didn't actually found the Suicide Club.
No. I joined it when I was 18.
Yeah.
I was lucky.
For Suicide Club.
Yeah, the Suicide Club. I came in on the first event when I was 18, and within a couple months I was organizing events.
And then with Cacophony Society, basically Gary started doing some different things. Unfortunately, passed away.
Passed away at age 35, a heart attack.
Yeah. So tragic, and at the same time, kind of the energy for various reasons has sort of fallen out of the original. So that was 82, is that right?
He died in 83. Suicide Club kind of ended in 82. He had started a thing called the Gorilla Grotto, and was also doing a thing called the Answer Man, which was a pretty cool thing. And then he passed away really tragically before getting to write about anything that he was working on. But the energy was still there, and there were 6 or 7 people from the Suicide Club who were kind of bored, and like Reagan had been president for a while and seemed kind of dismal, and they wanted to do something, so they got together and started the Cacophony Society in 1986. And I was involved pretty soon thereafter. One of the main organizers, Jean Shofsky, was a very formidable woman. And we'd just broken up, and I wasn't really welcome around there for a couple of months. But I started showing up a little bit later and doing events. And we carried on, like one of our long-standing Suicide Club events was the annual potluck formal dress dinner on Golden Gate Bridge, which we started in 1977 in the Suicide Club. It carried on, I think, for 25 years before they shut us down. And finally, the Bridge Authority just said, that's it. We're going out there with 150, 200 people.
So it's pretty interesting with both these groups. Like, you started off being anonymous, but at a certain point, even if you're not seeking publicity, the cops, the authorities started becoming aware of you. Is that true? I mean,
they became aware of the dinner because it happened roughly the same time every year, March every year.
Yeah.
And
what did it consist of? What did you guys do?
Well, we would meet at the parking lot on the Marin side, and the largest groups ever went up there, probably about 200 people, and we'd be formally dressed, and people would bring out hibachis and really some fairly elaborate dinners. We had we had dancers that would come out sometimes, and we just set up right by the tower, which is a big walkway that goes around the tower, and you can fit about 150 people behind it before they start spilling out in the area where they can be seen by cars. And we had this giant potluck dinner and dance, and usually we could get out there and set up and have it all done before the cops knew we were there. By the time they figured out we were there were so many of us there, it took us, it was a whole process. One CHP guy would stop and go, hey, what's going on? There's like 200, 150 people like all dressed up in formal dress. Like, whoa, we're having our annual potluck dinner. He goes away. He like calls into the station, hey, what's up with this guy? Then they're like, no, permit? No, there's no, they can't. Let's go get him out of there. You know? So he comes back with another guy and we're like, oh, of course, officer. Well, sure, we'd be happy to start leaving now. Start leaving was the, that was, that was the really important, we did start leaving, which would take the process, take about an hour and a half. And really one time,
during which time you had to clean up the food and other things. Yeah.
I had a friend who was going to the event and couldn't make it there because he got stuck in traffic and was listening to KGO radio and heard that two men were in top hats were fencing. Traffic had stopped in both directions for miles. So they kind of had enough of us. They're like, okay, you can't do this anymore.
So we touched on bridges a little bit, and again, personally as well as with the groups. I mean, you absolutely love bridges. I want to put in a quick plug. John's written a slim volume of stories, some of which may or may not be based on true events. And one of the more interesting, I mean, they're all great, but there's one that is a chase scene of someone who is climbing a bridge. It's a slow motion chase scene of them trying to find that person crawling all around up inside the bridge, which is really good reading. You should check out. So, yeah, so I want to keep moving on because unfortunately our time is pretty limited.
Yeah.
So out of, and we talked, a little bit about in the pre-internet era that you were looking for like-minded folks.
Yeah, it's harder to find them then.
And we, Cacophony Society would go on to, things like the Santarchy, if you've heard of people running around in various cities dressed as Santa. If you've heard
that started at the Cacophony event in 1994.
Yeah.
And the Santa who shall not be named started it because he doesn't want to be named. And
actually, real quick, tell the story about Gary's the original precursor.
Well, Gary had read an article, and I have a clipping of this in Mother Jones magazine, of all things, in 1977 or 76, about a Danish political group called Solvenian. And they were really hardcore political group, which we were not at all. I mean, we were not involved in politics. One of the wonders of the early Suicide Club is it wasn't like some strident political group. But this group was very funny. And they were in Copenhagen, and they decided they didn't like the man in the state, and they decided that they were going to do something about it. So they got dressed up as Santas. They went into the largest department store in Copenhagen, like the Saturday before Christmas, and started giving away toys from the department store to children, to little kids, and going, here, Santa wants you to have this. And they were pretty radical and they refused to stop. And so the police were called and they ended up like literally taking the presents away from these little kids and beating up Santa. So if you wanted to be like a radical who could like show kids what the man's all about, now my politics are considerably more mild than that. But
that sounded like a great idea to Gary.
Funny.
So.
And Gary thought it was a really funny idea, and he wanted to do a Santa event, and he did a thing. He did a write-up for it, but it never went anywhere in the Suicide Club. And then Santa, who should not be named, later came along in the Cacophony Society, kind of independently had the idea of doing a Santa thing, and we were like, oh yeah, we were going to do one back then. And he ended up doing the event, and Michael and I helped him, Santa Michael and Santa Melmoth, which is the name I use. And we organized the first Santa thing in San Francisco. There were 30 Santas. And we just went it was a wonderful event. I mean, we went all around downtown. We crashed parties up on Nob Hill. And people would go in and, see, the thing about it was, there were no memes. There were no, like, internet memes at that time. People, when they saw 30 Santas, it was something that really, I don't know how to explain it. It was not an idea that people had in their heads, okay?
Even in San Francisco.
It doesn't matter. I mean, nobody had it in their head. So when they saw 30 Santas, it was like, people literally stood there with their jaw hanging open for like a minute because they couldn't believe it. Like, what is this? And now it's like, it's great. I mean, they do events where there are like 5,000 Santas show up. But see, everyone in the entire country, even if they haven't ever seen a Santa on the street, the meme's in their head because they saw it on TV or they saw it somewhere. Which is not bad, it's not a bad thing, but I'm trying to get across how different it was in the pre-internet era. And for kids now, that's hard to explain. I don't even know if you need to know this, or you care, but it was a very different era, a very different period.
One other plug I want to put in here is, I got to summarize the stuff because we're running pretty tight on time, but Santa would go on to Rampage twice in
San Francisco, and then in Portland.
Then in Portland, which was a very interesting affair, and this is documented in
Scott Field's movie, You Better Watch Out.
You can watch online for free. Look for You Better Watch Out. John features in it prominently amongst other people. And it is, when I moved here and started getting involved in some Cacophony Society events, the way I tried to explain it to people was just watch this and it will give you some idea of what's going on. Yeah. It's amazing.
Well, the idea with the Santa thing wasn't to just go out and get drunk and do a pub crawl. I mean, the idea was to blow people's minds. Yeah. And I don't know if it was like I wouldn't call it an anti-commercial statement or anything, although some people interpreted it that way. Because we went through Macy's, chanting "Charge it, charge it, charge it." We went when we did one in New York, we went to Saks Fifth Avenue. But the internet picked that up and it became a meme, and people started doing it independently of us. They started doing it all around the world.
Santa also picketed the UN.
Yeah, we picketed the UN. The last time I did it was '98. I was in New York. We picketed the UN.
UN off our
no
pole.
More reindeer games.
Off our pole.
UN out of our pole. Pretty fun. But it kind of like evolved into a bigger event and more of a party.
And what's interesting is these events started to take on a life of their own, where they were done. Started to be done annually. So in addition to, which I don't think happened as much, well, I guess happened somewhere.
We tried to avoid annual events. There were 2 annual events we did in the Suicide Club, the Bridge Dinner and the Chinese New Year's Treasure Hunt.
And then with the Cacophony Society, one thing we haven't mentioned is there's this Beta Breakers, the salmon run going against the stream.
Right, which was the Santa who shall not be named. That was his idea. He had all the good ideas.
No wonder he doesn't have time for a name. So with Beta Breakers, where they dress up as salmon and run in the opposite direction to the rest of
them, fighting their way upstream up the Hayes Street Hill.
That one.
And that was Cacophony. See, Cacophony was basically anybody could do anything they wanted to. Once again, the only difference really between Cacophony and the Suicide Club was Cacophony was out. I mean, we weren't paranoid about publicity. The Suicide Club, people said they're going to write about us, and we said no, don't write about us, don't do it, because we thought that the cops would actually care what we were doing and shut us down. Which actually I don't think they really did. We were pretty innocuous. But
so we only have a few minutes left. So a little transition here to another initially one-time Cacophony event that started to become an annual tradition was a little thing down at Baker Beach.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know how much we want. I don't know how many
people
have heard the story.
To death by 1 million people, much better than I could do it.
With our limited time, John, you and to be frank about this, I mean, when we first met, you weren't talking about Burning Man much, or you've had disagreements about it along the way.
It's a great event.
But now, I mean,
you're very different from when we were doing it.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, just from your reference point, not to get into some of the stories, but of the various books and so forth that are out there, what would you recommend as far as
Brian Doherty's history? This is Burning Man. It tells the story, and he's not.
You contributed to that.
Yeah. I mean, it's a fair appraisal of the history of the event. It's called "This Is Burning Man" by Brian Doherty, who's an editor for Reason magazine, and he's a very reasonable guy. And in the movie Dust and Illusions, Olivier Bonin, who's a French guy, so he's really got the intellectual angle on the whole thing, and really told the story in a good way. Those are media about the history of the event, not so much about having a good time and doing ecstasy and running around naked, but about the history of the event.
One thing, so I watched a little interview with a talk, you and Michael on stage and some others talking about it after a screening of Justice.
About Burning Man,
About Burning Man. But you said something really great there, which is an interesting sort of tie back to the Maker Faire thing. You said, do it yourself. But you didn't mean it in the typical, DIY we think of as bootstrapping and being able to do things yourself. What you were actually saying there, I think, was if you're inspired by this and you think it's amazing, then that means you should imitate, you should do your own version of it.
Absolutely.
Don't just, there is the saying, don't just be an attendant, be a participant. You should be an event organizer and do your own things that are inspired by and build on and add your own to.
Yeah, and the people who get the most out of Burning Man still are the people who go there and maybe are already doing something, or they start doing something when they're there, and then they take it and they make it into their yearly life. Yeah. They build a creative endeavor that's theirs. It's not Burning Man's. It's theirs, and then they can participate in that as they would in a convention.
And there are fantastic things that happen at Burning Man.
Oh yeah.
The one thing though that
the
biggest truism of anything here, and it goes back to that earlier point of don't believe them when they tell you it's over. If you haven't gone, you should go.
Yeah, I do that.
It is a mind-expanding, life-changing experience.
I haven't been there since 1996, but I know people who go, and that's the truth.
So we got to literally fly through the last couple of slides here. This is Scott Beal. You are actually a partner in Laughing Squid. We've got some Laughing Squid.
Smartest thing I ever did in my life.
And I don't know. I guess there's not a lot. I also write for Laughing Squid. We're biased. Laughing Squid. I'll just give a quick sort of mention of it, then we can show a couple other things. This is Jillian. Jillian's going to be presenting later. This is one of her photographs right here of the iconic dog. That's what we haven't even talked about, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But LaughingSquid.com, check it out. It's a fantastic culture blog.
It was very crucial. That Laughing Squid was very crucial in the transition from printing your stuff on paper with machines that spit ink on you to pushing a button and having 100,000 people see your thing. It was a great transitional organ.
Both John and I have blogged on there. We, amongst other things, do some history, just talk about some history stuff there. So it's worth perusing for what's going on right now.
Great
but
stuff on the
also
blog.
some of this stuff is expanded upon there. This is John Alloway. John's part of the LA Cacophony. We didn't even talk again about Cacophony had chapters in LA, in Portland,
New York, Detroit, Seattle, Atlanta, Chicago.
And John is from LA, and he's making a documentary, which is in the works right now.
It's just about finished, called Tales from the Zone, and it's the history of the Cacophony Society. And you've got footage going back to the 70s of the Suicide Club and on through till the current day. And it's going to premiere in San Francisco at the Castro Theater on April 7th. I think you can quote me on that. The date might change.
Into the Zone, and I think you can even look it up on IMDb. I think he's got
probably. And he's going to run it in LA. I don't know the date, but he's got an Egyptian theater date in LA at some point.
So, and just in our last couple minutes, and this is Kevin Evans, who's a longtime Cacophony
member, and an artist, brilliant artist.
Yeah, and he did a lot of visual work and continues to do visual work for some countercultural stuff. Mm-hmm. So you want to talk about this amazing? So this is this the first time people will have seen this cover of anybody outside of the people working on it?
Yeah.
I mean, cool.
Yeah, this is the cover. We're doing a book on Cacophony for Last Gasp Publishing, and this is Kevin's cover, which I don't know about you, but I think it's the coolest book cover I've ever seen in my life. And different little iconic things in there, but it's sort of the story of the Cacophony Society using material from the period. And then the old newsletters, photographs, news articles, personal screeds, writings, flyers, party event flyers, and the book will be on the streets in about a year.
No, it's what's the release date next year, right?
It's late fall. September, October next year.
Last Gasp, fantastic comic book and other cultural publisher in San Francisco. Look at Last Gasp, and you'll see as news comes out about it. So thank you guys so much. Unfortunately, we got to go. There's no time for questions. I'm going to play one little last slideshow that'll go as we go. Pull him and ask him questions.
Any questions?
Yeah. Well, let's.
Say what that is.
Huh?
Say what that is.
Oh, say what that is.
Oh, that's the Bay Bridge, looking down on the Bay Bridge. Like many, many, many years ago, the statute of limitations run out a long time ago. But yeah, we used to climb bridges and just hang out and, never change the environment we were in. Actually, my friend John Gilmore, who was in the Suicide Club, he's one of the guys who started the Electronic Frontier Foundation. He told me one time, he climbed bridges with me back in the early 80s, and he said, yeah, man, we climbed the Golden Gate Bridge and we left these "We Are Here" stickers. And I'm like, no, go get them. And I got so mad. I was like, dude, you have to go back and take them down. Don't put any stickers up there. They'll know you're there. Wow. So he actually went back and took them off.
So I'm going to leave with this video, and this, as I started to put this together and was looking at a bunch of images of John, I realized so many of them were with other incredible people and makers, and literally people that are involved in the Maker Faire today. So
that's one of my heroes, Mark. But we already talked about SRL, Mark Pauline, who is a visionary artist, very much so. Started an entire art movement, you know, machine art movement. Every
You
machine
just
art
say that
thing
because
you see
you're in it.
that's happening now owes a little bit to this man right here, Mikl Em.
So just watch as we go. We've got to get out of here and let the next folks set up. But thank you so much. Really appreciate you being here.